Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to this Lunch and Learn opportunity with the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. We are part of 90 councils across the country who engage their communities in these kinds of open discussions of timely topics. We are nonpartisan, and we strive to inform our members and our community about pressing global issues and how they affect us locally. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join us. You can find information about membership and all our upcoming events on our website at www.pawac.org. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Dima Issa. She is an assistant professor and serves as chairperson of the Mass Media and Communication Department at the University of Balamand in Lebanon. She holds a PhD from the University of Westminster in London, an MSc from the London School of Economics in Global Media and Communications, and an MA from the University of Southern California in Global Communications. Her research has primarily focused on Arab diaspora and media consumption, looking at ways in which identity is constructed and reconstructed through space and time. In addition, her interests include gender and representation, popular culture and audience studies, new media and technologies, and social networking. Before academia, Dima worked in the corporate sector in media relations, publications, and website management, as well as broadcast journalism. She has lived in Lebanon, Canada, Qatar, London, and California. Dr. Issa will begin with a few minutes of prepared comments, and then we will take questions from you. I also have a few questions to put in the middle there. So as we get going, I encourage you to type your questions in the chat, and away we go. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Issa, take us away.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you all for being here. And thank you to the Peoria Area World Affairs Council for having me on here. I'm very excited to discuss this notion of women and war, albeit it's a sad subject matter. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, just a quick presentation. Here we go. I don't know what this is. All right. Okay. Sorry. So I'm just going to start with a small presentation just to set up the framework of this discussion. It's important to kind of discuss this idea of war as a humanitarian issue. War and conflict have devastating effects on all parties involved, but it is often women and children who bear the brunt of the violence on multiple levels. Forced displacement, gender-based violence, looming uncertainty, loss, and fear are just some of the outcomes of wars and conflicts. War magnifies the discriminatory, dangerous, and unjust conditions that plague women around the world. Through this discussion, I hope to show that war should be a feminist issue, regardless of ethnicity, nationality, race, class, sexuality, and religion. It is imperative to examine war through the lens of feminism to better understand the short-term and long-term implications of violence on communities around the world. Moreover, as a political movement, feminists should collectively address and advocate against the discrimination and injustices that women in conflict zones are experiencing. Failure to do so further highlights the limitations of some forms of feminism that cater to and include only specific types of women while excluding others under the pretext of women's rights. So according to a UN Secretary General report that was published in October 2023, more than 600 million women and girls live in conflict-affected areas, an increase of 50% since 2017. Aid and resources are scarce as governments increase military funding. These negative trends set back women's rights and gender equality, allowing dark histories to repeat themselves. When fighting broke out in the Sudan in April 2023, widespread sexual violence terrorized the women and girls of Darfur and elsewhere in the country, mirroring violence witnessed in Darfur 2 decades ago. According to the United Nations Population Fund, some 6.3 million people are displaced inside Sudan, while more than 1.8 million people have fled to equally fragile neighboring countries in the region, such as Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. Most of the displaced are women and children. In addition, a hunger crisis is looming for 18 million people across the country, with the most desperate trapped behind front lines. Estimated 1.2 million pregnant and breastfeeding women are acutely malnourished. The healthcare system has not been spared by the fighting. Women and girls face extreme challenges in accessing reproductive health care, challenges that are exacerbated for the estimated 150,000 displaced women who are currently pregnant. Around 80% of hospitals in conflict-afflicted areas are no longer functioning due to shortages of supplies and displacement of staff. The health facilities that remain operational are overwhelmed by the influx of people seeking care, many of whom are internally displaced, straining the country's health system to its very limits. Protection risks have also soared. Kidnappings, forced marriage, intimate partner violence, conflict-related sexual violence, and harmful practices such as child marriage continue to be reported as access to protection services and support is severely compromised. In addition, according to the NGO Caritas, women in Gaza, Ukraine, and Yemen constitute around 80% of the world's displaced people due to current conflicts. As of March 1st, 2024, there have been over 30,000 Palestinians killed by Israel. Around 9,000 of them are women and over 12,000 are children. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, Palestinian women and girls have been randomly executed in Gaza, often together with family members, including their children. UN experts have also expressed serious concern about the detention of hundreds of Palestinian women and girls, including human rights defenders, journalists, and humanitarian workers in Gaza and the West Bank since October 7th. Many have reportedly been subjected to inhumane and degrading treatments, denied menstruation pads, food, and medicine, and severely beaten. On at least one occasion, Palestinian women detained in Gaza were allegedly kept in a cage in the rain and cold without food. Reports have also circulated that Palestinian women and girls in detention have been subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault, such as being stripped naked and searched by male Israeli army officers. At least 2 female Palestinian detainees were reportedly raped, while others were threatened with rape and sexual violence. Experts also noted that photos of female detainees in degrading circumstances were taken by the Israeli army and uploaded online. In addition, experts expressed concern that an unknown number of Palestinian women and children, including girls, have gone missing after contact with the Israeli army in Gaza. The report makes mention of at least 1 female infant forcibly transferred by the Israeli army into Israel and of children being separated from their parents whose whereabouts remain unknown. Women and girls in Gaza are resorting to unsafe ways of managing their periods amid a severe shortage of period products and catastrophic humanitarian conditions. Displaced women living in Rafah are so desperate, they are cutting out small pieces of tents they rely on for shelter from the cold and rain to use as a substitute for period products, risking infection. The lack of water means keeping clean is near impossible, with women going for weeks without showering. The psychological and physical consequences are alarming. In Ukraine, it is estimated that there are 10,000 civilian deaths, and women constitute around 3,000 of those deaths. In addition, there have been multiple reports about cases of rape and gender-based violence on women. When the horror is extensive, women's voices are often lost. By understanding war as a feminist issue, mobilization takes a different course, one that advocates for policies and interventions that promote gender equality, prioritize the protection of women's rights, and work towards sustainable peace and security for all. In addition, they allow for a restructuring of a post-war era that take into consideration the dynamics needed for women to reintegrate into society. I don't want to spend too much time on definitions, but it's important here to define what is meant by feminism in order to solidify my argument. Feminism as a socio-political movement has existed since 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. However, there are literary, philosophical, and mythological references that precede that date. The goal of feminism is arguably to secure economic, social, and political equality for women. Feminism is difficult to define because there's so many branches of it that need to be contextualized according to a specific time, need, and circumstance. Like many political movements, power and privilege have eradicated the heterogeneity of feminism and what it means. As Dima writes, feminism also comes with its share of inclusivity and exclusivity, which can isolate and marginalize many women and their plights. It is therefore important to take a more intersectional approach to feminism. Intersectionality was the term coined by feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, who looked at violence against women of color. For Crenshaw, intersectionality may provide a means for dealing with other marginalizations as well, since it takes into account different forms of identity politics, which merge and diverge across various groups. Through an awareness of intersectionality, writes Crenshaw, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us and negotiate the means by which these differences will find expression in constructing group politics. This is mostly evident in situations of war, conflict, and militarism. Feminist perspectives highlight the ways in which militarism reinforces patriarchal structures, perpetuating cycles of violence and domination. Military institutions often uphold traditional notions of masculinity and prioritize male experiences, marginalizing women's voices and contributions. Hackett and Hopton have discussed the reciprocal relationship between militarism and masculinity, looking at the ways in which the two feed into each other, with politicians utilizing ideologies of idealized masculinity that glamorize the notion of strong, active males who collectively risk their personal safety for the greater good of the community, and then, at the same time, the ways in which militarism feeds into ideologies of masculinity through the emphasis on risk-taking and violence. By bringing these concepts together, it is clear that there needs to be a reframing and disassociating from ethnocentric feminisms that are turning a blind eye to the atrocities found in different parts of the world, in part to counter the toxic masculine traits of war and militarism, as well as to include, acknowledge, and provide solidarity to all victims of violence under the umbrella of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Issa. That is a lot to think about here. A few quick questions for me, and I invite you all who are participating to type in some questions as well in the chat. I will pay attention to the chat and ask questions as well from there. Let me get started though with a couple of interesting questions, particularly related to the points you made last. The perceptions of men go to war, women go to work. That is not the case in modern warfare. I'm not sure if it was ever the case in any warfare, because warfare most definitely affects women, perhaps in a different way. You know, we're familiar with the Rosie the Riveter kind of image, but the reality is, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of a disassociated voice in the background here. Women in current conflicts in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan, and elsewhere, are we less valuable in the war effort if we are taking care of families and trying to rebuild societies while the men go off with the guns? Or are women who go off with the guns treated the same way as the men who go off with the guns? What kind of differences do you see in today's warfare on the gender roles?
I think that what we're seeing is, you know, there's a new kind of warfare that's been taking place that I don't think that anyone has ever seen before, where, you know, structures, complete structures, and, you know, within the cities, within different parts of Gaza and Ukraine are being dismantled, which doesn't allow for kind of like a working environment. And we're not talking about a war. You know, if we're talking about a war, there's an army that's involved, that's, you know, that's defending and fighting back. But when you're talking about a situation in which, you know, citizens are being bombarded consistently, their economy was already something that was very much controlled. There wasn't this ability to have kind of like, there wasn't like this factory life that you had during the world wars, in which, you know, the women then went on to work in the factories and things like that. We're not seeing this here at all. We're seeing this kind of complete you know, destruction and violence of spaces, of places. So women's roles, you know, the thing is that whenever we think of women, we think of their roles in their private and in the public sphere. their private roles within the domestic sphere are being completely, it's so difficult for them to kind of comprehend what's going on. In addition, a lot of them maybe were not working because of the, the economic situation within Gaza, for example. So I feel that it's a very different field to compare, because with the world wars, you had kind of economic development and growth that was happening. You had an army that was fighting against other armies. In this situation, it's not the case where you have armies fighting against each other. You have bombardment and consistent bombardment, which is kind of destroying the structures that are in place. So the jobs that we're seeing are maybe like, I don't know, like selling very basic things that they would be able to get just to get some, to get some basic needs and food and things like that. But even that is not being provided for.
That's a good point. I think I would like to add that during the world wars in the United States in particular, women went to the factories and we were not fighting on US soil. So we didn't have to worry about my factory getting bombed. I mean, maybe in the back of our head, we thought about it, but it was remote. In Ukraine, in Gaza, and Sudan, this is daily. And when you try to reopen your shop in Ukraine, every day you worry about whether or not Russia's going to destroy your power system again. In Gaza, can you even open a shop, or are you just busy spending all day long trying to find resources for your family? So the role of women is Herculean. And so, I mean, the role of men fighting is also there, but women fight a different kind of war on the home front. How do you think the imagery of women with weapons will change the way that women are perceived as having a role in warfare?
It depends where you're talking about, and this is the unfortunate thing, Angela. The way in which Arab women are. I'm going to talk about Arab women first, and then I'll move on. But this idea of the way that Arab women are represented in Western media is always kind of seen as a very they're seen in a very barbaric light, or they're seen as very submissive and oppressed. So you have this kind of like very stereotyped perspectives of women living in the Arab world, whereas a lot of women have held arms. They were accomplished resistance fighters, because a lot of the times there's so many internal conflicts as well that are happening. We can't homogenize the whole population based on their political ideology. Obviously that differs from place to place, and so it's very dependent on where you are. For example, a few years ago, when there was the Lebanese uprising, the women's bodies were used, as kind of like the symbol of revolution, of of moving forward, of progress, but it was a very kind of strategic use of the female body to kind of showcase strength and determination. But obviously, I mean, the outcomes of that are not great. But this idea of women as body and what they represent, for the West, a lot of times, women's Arab bodies are always seen in a very kind of like violent perspective, and this is quite detrimental to the way in which women are trying to kind of like find their own space and find their own way within the conflict as well.
Excuse me. You mentioned the situation of rape of Palestinian women, because in the aftermath of Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's response to that attack, the tone changed when people in the United States started to be a little more concerned about the violence against the people of Gaza. Then the news came out that the Israeli prisoners, may have been subjected to sexual violence. And yet it's also occurred by the Israeli soldiers against people, women in Gaza and previously in the West Bank. How is rape, and this is just the Gaza example, but rape is a weapon of power. It's not necessarily even restricted to gender, by the way. And so how sexual violence is not actually recognized as a criminal offense according to the Geneva Conventions. Most of the world frowns on it, but then defining what it is becomes a challenge. How does that change women's roles, the use of sexual violence, particularly against women?
You know, Cynthia Enlow has a great piece on this idea of the international politics of militarizing women's lives, and she talks about rape, and she talks about the different types of rape, because there are different types of rape. So you have, rapes between enemy forces and civilians. You have internal, between the military themselves, between civilians themselves. There's so many different forms of sexual violence that takes place. So it's really important to understand that rape, when it's used in warfare, is a very strategic weapon in order for the military to accomplish some of its goals. Especially, I don't know if you remember what happened with Bosnia after the Yugoslavian war, where there was this huge kind of like mass rape that happened, and it was the first time that a lot of women came forward and discussed the sexual violence that they encountered. It was a Bosnian Muslim women from the Bosnian Serb military. And so that was kind of like a big awakening, I think, of how sexual violence occurs on the battlefield and the implications behind it. And then it became kind of this, like, it became something that people were taking more seriously than before. A lot of the times, especially with ethnic cleansing, a lot of the times there is, the want to rape in order to impregnate, so that there's children from the military occupation. So again, the use of women's bodies in that way, because trying to really kind of hone in this idea of they don't want any more generations to come out of the person that they consider the civilian population. So there's all these different kind of factors that come in, when we talk about sexual violence, especially also in Rwanda. There were a lot of cases of rape, and the way in which the media played a huge role in trying to kind of like dehumanize women, so that if the military or whoever was raping them, it was justified. And this is also what we see within the media, right? This idea that let's dehumanize the population, let's weaponize language to kind of like silence any criticism, so that whenever we do whatever we want to them, then that is justified through forms of sexual violence and any form of violence as well.
Yeah, it's a really important point, because often we talk about the violence between men and women, but as I noted, it can be men against men, and women can also provoke sexual violence. So we don't talk about the men against men because that's kind of, that doesn't happen. That would be an insult to masculinity, but that happens more often than we are willing to admit. So it may be time really to have this conversation about the use of sexual violence in war, and whether that should fall under some kind of rules of, that's an oxymoron, the rules of war. But there are basic human rights that should be respected in times of war. And that's our horizon. That's our sexual violence is the next major topic to talk about. The gender roles in general around the world are coming under intense pressure to maintain the traditional values of our societies and to change to reflect what societies actually look like now. In some cases, Ireland, for example, recently rejected an amendment to their constitution, which would have removed the indications that women's perfect role is in the home. And then others are enshrining in their constitutions rules that protect women at work and women's ability to rise in society. What do you see overall? You specialize in the Arab world. Is there any progress toward an expansion of rights for women across the Arab world?
I mean, I think that this is kind of been placed on the back burner. There's so much that still needs to be done, and this is when why I say when I was talking, Angela, about this idea that feminism, you can't apply one kind of idea of feminism on all different societies, because all different societies have different requirements and different circumstances. Women in Lebanon, unfortunately, I mean, they have some basic rights, but there are still a lot that still need to be done. And I don't want to be put in this position where where I feel like I'm kind of like being a traitor to my Arab feminismness, because there's always this kind of like perception that women in the Arab world are extremely oppressed and submissive and all that kind of stuff, which is not always true. We're very diverse. We have huge differences within our governments, and there's so many differences within our laws as well. Unfortunately, in Lebanon, we still have certain laws that are very kind of rigid. One of them being the citizenship law. So women cannot pass on citizenship to their children. In addition, a lot of women, they cannot open bank accounts for their children. The men have to do it. And this is problematic in cases of war, for example, when there are people who go missing. So there's no death certificate. And this happened, a lot after the Civil War, where a lot of, men went missing, and, women can't open a bank account because there's no official document stating that their husbands have died or anything like that, so that they're now responsible. So, you have these kind of like issues that take place that make it a little bit cumbersome for women to be able to gain complete autonomy within society. There have been some great wins for the women's movement. There was a rape law that was, that is now no longer there, in which men who raped women would, if they ended up marrying the woman, would be absolved of their crime. But now that's no longer there. So that's one win that we have. But I mean, there's still a lot more, there's still a lot more to be done. For example, domestic rape is still not something that's considered, a crime. So there are different things that we're working on. Obviously, the women's movement have been very active in trying to combat a lot of these old laws. But at the same time, because we've had a stalled government, we don't have a president, so we have all these different kind of things taking place in which women's issues always end up becoming like sidelined for something else. I can't hear you.
Sorry, my printer was trying to restart. So there's a couple comments in the chat that I would like to share. Sexual violence in the Arab world is taken at a different level. There's a sense of shame that sticks with the women, as you were just pointing out, and is frowned upon. Many of these women end up killing themselves or being killed by their family, a crime of honor. And then there's a response to that there are at least 2 non-Arab cultures that condone femicide for family honor while celebrating toxic masculinity that expects those opportunity. There is a docudrama, a biodrama, The Whistleblower, that came out in 2010 with Rachel Weitz. She speaks to the UN peacekeepers about dehumanization and participating in human trafficking and sexual violence. The experiences of Bosnian women and in Bosnia and elsewhere. These are important issues to talk about when we talk about women in war. A question from another participant: do we need more women in positions of power to reduce the travesty of the imbalance of genders, or is changing men's attitude toward women more significant?
Angela, I just wanted to comment on that first question, because it's quite important, this idea of shame. A lot of women, and it's not just Arab women, a lot of women, again, this is part of what Cynthia Enlow talked about in her 2000 article. A lot of women who have had sexual violence, who have had an instance of sexual violence, are afraid to speak out a lot of the times, even in war, because a lot of the times they could be killed, they could be frowned upon from their families, especially if they're in female-led households where they're kind of like the main kind of like person within the house. So there are so many different factors that go in there. So yes, it's extremely important to bring that point up, this idea of shame and this idea of not wanting to talk about the violence that was inflicted on them. And the second question, I forget, you said something, women in power. Yes, we definitely need more women in power. I mean, this is something that goes without saying. Women need to be, unfortunately, again, we have a very kind of a sectarian system in which political parties are divided according to their sect and their political ideology, which kind of go hand in hand a lot of the times. And a lot of the times, the women that end up being elected are either kind of like they've inherited that position, or they're women who, that are part of a political party or a political agenda, and then they're just kind of like that mouthpiece for it. And so a lot of the times what happens is that there aren't enough voices for women's issues. Women bring, they bring different perspectives to the table, and it's extremely important for their perspectives to be there, because without them, they'll just go unnoticed. And so definitely, I think that there needs to be a woman in power. Organizations are now trying to, at kind of like the ground level, businesses and organizations are trying to get more women on board to be able to kind of like, set up different kind of business structures. And so politically, that needs to translate as well, because women's participation in politics is extremely important for a number of reasons.
And that's true at home as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think it's true everywhere. I think that, women, no matter where they are, they bring in a different kind of set of ideas, and they think about things. It's the woman who's going to talk about, the badly lit street on the campus, so that, women, students feel safe at night, and they don't feel like, they're going to be scared when they're walking to their cars, because women have experienced these kind of situations. So I feel that they would allow for that.
And that's a really good point. The idea, another participant has thrown in, Israel theoretically prides itself on required military service for men and women. I found it striking that we see no images of women IDF soldiers in this particular struggle with Gaza. They are 34% of the current IDF force. I can't think of how to ask this question. Oh, never mind. Do you have thoughts on why aren't we of Israeli women fighting when they make up a third of the fighting force?
I don't know. We have seen, I mean, some of the images that we've seen here, there's a lot, especially on social media, you do see a lot of women in combat. And a lot of the times, TikTok, social media has played a huge role in showcasing a lot of female faces. But I think that maybe, there's a very important reason for women to be seen on the battlefield, especially if we're talking about the Israeli army, because it's kind of this idea that everyone is backing this agenda. So I feel that I have seen some images. I'm not sure about Western media again. We have paywalls here, so it's very difficult to get access all the time to Western media. But I mean, we try to follow up on social media, so we do see a lot of kind of images from different news outlets with female fighters, for sure. We have seen them. I don't know if I answered the question. I don't know if that was the question that I answered, but
no. But I wonder if it's Western media that kind of recoils from the image of women actually fighting, like military fighting, versus seeing women mourning their families or grubbing for food, or trying to take care of their families at home, when there are plenty of women at the front. I have also been asked about women fighting in Ukraine. How come none of the women in Ukraine are at the front? And I too, because I follow Russia and Ukraine personally and closely, I have seen plenty of images, and some of them are just horrific bombs and bullets don't care what gender you are. Right. But we don't see the women fighting. There's always the human interest story about, this woman who volunteered to be an ambulance driver, or that woman who is, supplying the munitions. She's bringing the munitions to the men at the front, when there are plenty of women at the front as well. So I wonder what that says about our society, that we recoil from seeing dead female soldiers, or maimed and injured female soldiers, when our own Senator Tammy Duckworth lost her legs in battle. So it's interesting to see how women are presented in media, generally speaking, around the world. Another question, I'm interested in understanding more about how we, particularly in the Midwest, can support the amplification of women's voices in war and conflict through the media. Could you share some strategies or insights on where you think our efforts can be most effectively directed?
I mean, right now, I think that it's more about just kind of getting the message across. I think that, honestly, I think that social media played a huge part in this war, especially if we're talking about the Gaza war, because a lot of journalists are not allowed to enter Gaza, so it had to be from the people on the ground that were kind of reporting and sending videos and things like that. And I think that the best way to kind of advocate for women's rights and women's issues is to discuss them and to kind of shed light on them. Because at the end of the day, a lot of them end up, they go unnoticed because there's obviously so much going on with the world, whether it's in Ukraine and Gaza and Yemen. There's so many different places where women's voices are being kind of muted in the background because there's so many other things that are happening. But I do think that the kind of idea of reading what's going on, posting what's going on, recirculating, writing, I think academia is great for this kind of stuff, sharing space with people to be able to discuss certain issues, informing, audiences about what's been happening and discussing it. I think that that's really the best way to kind of move forward with kind of advocating for women's rights.
There is a trend on college campuses and elsewhere, so starting at the local level and expanding out toward the global level of something that's referred to as teaching consent culture, that men and women need to verbally, not just, by not saying verbally no, but verbally saying yes to consent. And then we have the pushback in our own political system that this DEI and all this, touchy-feely stuff is unnecessary. We're going too far. Where do we find the balance of educating ourselves about humanity and the rights of human beings, let alone the rights of gendered people or non-gendered people for that matter? Non-binary people also take a big hit in these times.
Angela, it's really upsetting because I feel that a lot of the things that are happening are very much kind of, the media plays a huge role in the way in which we see other people, this idea that there's always kind of this binary that's put in place between us and them. And it goes all ways. So you need to put that out there, right? It doesn't just go one way. Right. It goes out there, but obviously that there are certain media institutions that have more power than other institutions in kind of promoting this idea of dehumanizing the other, demonizing the other, making them feel like that they're different. I'm assuming you're talking about with regards to consent is sexual consent. Is that what is that what you're talking about?
It is.
Sorry, I kind of, we don't have this here. So yeah. So, I mean, yeah, obviously consent is extremely important. But, this is a very different society that we're talking about as well. Sexual kind of behaviors within Arab society, even if it happens, is not something that people usually talk about quite openly. I mean, we do openly talk about, sex, but it's not about, we don't really talk about it in this specific situation where people are constantly kind of like discussing it. It's everywhere, the media is, on it and all that kind of stuff. It's much more, kind of subdued. And it's, I think that it's really important. And, when we as educators, when we share space with our students, I think it's important for us talk about these things, to talk about the side that, it's really important to value yourself as a person, because, you are who you are, and we have to respect who you are, respect yourself, and also kind of like say no is fine, and you shouldn't be ashamed of saying no if something makes you feel uncomfortable, and also speaking out if something makes you feel uncomfortable. There are some universities now that have started adopting Title IX, which is great. So there's all these kind of like things that are happening in order to protect different marginalized groups as well on campus. But I think that for us as educators, it's really important for us to allow our students to have that safe space, because, no matter where you are in the world, there's always going to be some place that's going to make them feel unsafe. So at least if we make them feel safe and valued, then they know how to react in a place where they're feeling unsafe. I don't know if I answered that question. I'm not sure.
To bring it back to the question about war, and as you all know, you're tuning in today because it is Women's History Month here in the United States. And so we picked this topic particularly to focus on in March. But the general theme that prompted us to invite you to speak is the media representation of women. Do you think the media in general, both Western and perhaps in the Arab world, was kinder, gentler? I mean, we heard all about the atrocities committed against women and unarmed people in Ukraine. We hear almost nothing about that in Gaza. So do you think, what do you think about the media representation of conflicts that are perhaps similar in nature, but represented very differently in the media?
It's so upsetting, to be honest. You know, Angela, somebody who's kind of lived in America, who's lived in the States, who's had a lot of friends from that region, you know, I feel that it's really kind of a betrayal because the media has played a very polarizing role in this war. And it's not even a war, it's an assault. Let's call it what it is. Okay, it's not, I wouldn't call it a war. I would call it an assault. Women and children are being massacred. And we don't get anything from the Western media. Now, there has been a small shift because my students worked on this. So we've done projects looking at Western media's responses to what's happening and also looking at other parts of the world. So we've done a complete study. And, you know, it's really important to involve your students in things like this so that they can see what's going on. Because at the end of the day, the media does kind of show you a very kind of skewed perspective of the world. And I think that, you know, this is something that is everywhere, not just in the US. And it's you know, things that were happening that were you know, the bombardments, the killing, the massacres. And, you know, for example, there was a small tiny piece like in the New York Times, you know, besides, you know, something else. Or for example, that day there was, you know, Fox News had put like some report on a dog or something like that. So things that were very kind of like, you know, we're not talking about like 10 people, we're talking about thousands of people, you know, so there's always this kind of like disconnect between, you know, what is actually happening and between the Western kind of representation of what's happening on the ground. And, you know, and I think that this is a systematic kind of like a process in which Arabs in general who have been represented on Western media have been represented in a certain way. So, you know, whenever you think of the word Arab, and this is something we talk about all the time, it's not like it's research that's been done for years. But, you know, when you talk about Arab representation, what do you talk about? So if I say the word Arab to you, automatically, if I'm talking to a Western audience, automatically they go to, you know, terrorism, violence, angry, you know, hypersexualized men and very kind of submissive females. And this is, you know, this is kind of like the recirculation of messages that have been going on. And, you know, James Sheehan did a great documentary called Real Bad Arabs. And he talks about how because of the way in which Arabs have been dehumanized in Western media, it makes it easier to kill them. And this is something that's really important because, you know, the documentary that he did showcased the different perspectives in which Arabs were seen on screen, the very negative portrayals and the negative stereotypes that were associated with them. And when you constantly see that, you've dehumanized them. So if they die, you don't have that empathy that you would have, for example, unless, you know, for other people. And the best example is what happened, you know, the differences in opinions in the Ukraine, for example. So, you know, when the Ukraine refugees, I'm not sure if you saw this, but, you know, when the Ukraine refugees were kind of like, you know, evacuating versus when Syrian refugees were evacuating, the rhetoric and the narrative that was constantly being played on Western stations was like, this is happening in Europe. These are white people with blue eyes. These are Europeans. You know, this is, you know, these are middle class. They're not Arabs. And this is something that, you know, when you have that that distinction and representation, there's going to be some kind of like, you know, apathy towards people that don't really matter to you because we haven't been taught that they matter. Does that make sense?
It does. We, as a nation, we immediately enacted a new rule allowing Ukrainians to seek asylum and fast track their green cards, where we have done that for nobody else, from
Right.
Sudan, from, you know, Congo, from other war zones, but we did for Ukraine. And as a person who does Russian history, I'm not opposed to that. But the contradiction stands out quite sharply, how they were treated.
It's upsetting. It's
And
upsetting.
Europe
I know with the
is,
ban, there's like so many things there.
yeah, Europe is sending
Yeah.
them back because they're tired of their refugees, but they're sending back all of their refugees, not just their Ukrainian ones. And so they're anxious to ship many of them back. We have Danielle Glassmeyer said that she just looked at the IDF soldiers, female IDF soldiers, and she is officially horrified at the number, the content that she has found for that. So always good to be aware of things we don't necessarily look at on the first page.
But you
So
know, this is really interesting because you know and this is what I'm happy about, this idea that there's an exchange of ideas, and you know, there's never enough research to be done. So this could be something that you know could potentially lead to research, because what you were saying, Angela, is really important. This idea that why aren't women seen on the battlefields in Western media? There must be some reason, right? And it's not that they're not existing, that they're there, but why are we not seeing them? And this, I think, is something that, you know, maybe we can think of academically for something, for sure.
I can tell you a separate story of how I spoke to the retired officers last week, and and I can tell you exactly why the U.S. media doesn't cover women at war. Hind asks, considering that the U.S. is the major supporter of Israeli weapons political system, and is considering the notion that U.S. media is free and powerful, there's a huge responsibility on the U.S. media to be held accountable for their failure and for their support of one side. And I would, because we have these open discussions, so I know I will get email later, I would also like to pose a question to you for someone who lives in the region. Why does complaints about the government of Israel equate to anti-Semitism, whereas the complaints about the government of Ukraine being corrupt are not anti-Ukrainian, or the complaints about the government of Rwanda, that fellow's been in place since 1994. Why does that not equate to a condemnation of the entire, a criticism of some unfair assessment? Have you or your students looked into any of that kind of difference? The Israeli situation seems unique compared to other conflicts in the way that it's being defended in the media.
The thing is, Angela, and this is something that we talk about.
Oh, you're stuck. Shoot.
And so the most important thing, I think, okay?
Yeah, now you're going.
Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Can you hear me? I can hear you great. Can you hear me, Angela?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
I think you're cutting out.
It just telling me that my internet connection is unstable. Welcome to Lebanon. This is just, I'm going to try to switch to another. Yeah, I will try to, can you hear me well? It's okay?
Yeah, you're doing okay. Your face is frozen, but we can hear you fine. Oh, now I think we've lost you. And if anyone in participating here has more questions, please get them typed in. We're just about out of time. Yes, you're back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, my connection is unstable. So this is a very kind of but you know, this idea of discourse and language is something that we talk about a lot when we talk about media representation. And it's the use of the weaponization of language, right? So, you know, when you have a rhetoric of, you know, a president that says that they are not certain of any of the numbers that the Palestinians are putting forward, you know that there's kind of like this doubt that is going to be cast on a whole population. This idea of the weaponization of certain terms as well is also something important, right? This idea of anti-Semitism and kind of, you know, whatever, if you're critical, you're anti-Semitic, right? And if you're not, then you're pro Hamas, right? And it's always leading back. And this is that discourse and that binary that I was talking about. You should be able to be critical and to engage intellectually and intelligently about a certain incident that's happening without being called out as anti-Semitic. And this is problematic, and this is something that is being constantly used, and this is constantly used by certain media people as well, right? This idea that we want to weaponize the use of language in order not to allow for engagement and discussion and discourse. And so also you have kind of this other narrative that leads everything back to Hamas, right? So it's like, if you're not there, you're there, and that's it. That's the binary. That's the two things that they're giving you. And this is something that has been systematic within the media from a long time ago, right? This idea of us and them, and that dichotomy between, they're not us, this is us, and kind of, polarizing further through language. And so, when we talk about things and calling things out for what they are, let's define them for what they are. If we're talking about and trying to be critical, it's not anti-Semitism if we're discussing this topic, for example, especially for being engaged critically with what's going on. I don't know if I answered this.
No, that's a good answer, and I think that answers Hin's question.
Are you froze?
Yeah, with the being able to have these kinds of conversations like the World Affairs Council does. We take no position, but we have to be able to talk about it. And we're coming to the end of our hour. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you think we should throw out there, Dr. Issa?
No, and I'm very happy, but I just wanted to add to what you were saying is that, you need to have this debate. You need to have deliberative democracies in which there's an engagement of ideas and engagement, because at the end of the day, there's so many different voices that need to be heard, not just one. And that's it. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, thank you. So on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, thank you very much for joining us. It's 8 o'clock your time. What time is it?
Yeah. It's 8 o'clock now, so time for bed for the kids. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Angela, for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Oh, I think we have somebody who raised their hand. Just a second. One more quick question. She says thank you. Is that all you need?
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. But yes, as noted, the World Affairs Council is a nice place to agree to disagree. We don't have to come to the same conclusion, but we do have to know what's going on. And we have to be able to hear from experts like yourself that can share their insights and give us terrific things to think about as we become more active in our own systems and address these issues locally, because they affect us globally as well. So thank you, Dr. Issa. Again, if you are not a member of the World Affairs Council, I strongly encourage you to become one. I've noticed in the list of participants today that some of you come from quite a distance. There are more than 90 councils across the country. If you don't want to join the Peoria Council, look for a local one. But we welcome all folks to have these kinds of conversations, to be informed, and hopefully to take action locally to affect how the United States behaves in the world and how the world treats us locally. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Issa. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye.